Welcome to The Global Signal, a podcast exploring how emerging technologies, international policy, and financial markets are reshaping global power. I'm Joshua Charles.
And I'm Benjamin Fields. Each episode, we move beyond the headlines to examine the strategic dynamics that will matter not just this year, but decades from now.
How innovation drives competition, how capital flows influence geopolitics, and where cooperation remains possible in a rapidly changing world. Let's get started.
Dr. Jordan Despanie is a Technology and Security Policy Fellow at the RAND Corporation, focused on global emerging risk and long-term U.S. strategic planning. He brings a rare blend of scientific rigor, entrepreneurial leadership, and policy insight, having founded and led multiple life sciences ventures before contributing to national security research. Trained as a pharmaceutical scientist at the University of Southern California, Dr. Despanie's expertise spans biopharmaceutical innovation, emerging AI ex-bio capabilities, and U.S.-China technological competition. His current work examines how the United States can strengthen its innovation capacity and institutional resilience to ensure strategic advantage. We're really excited to have you on the podcast, and we know that you're going to do a great job in teaching our audience a lot about national security, procurement, and defense. And we appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Ben and Josh. I'm very excited. This is my inaugural appearance on the Global Signal.
And we hope this is one of many. And so without further ado, I think this is a really hot topic in Washington, D.C. right now. And this is thematically about defense procurement. I think there can be a lot of arguments made that hey, there are a lot of positive developments in Washington, D.C. at this moment with respect to some of our demonstrations, even in the last 12 months. However, we do believe it's important to be mindful of some of the budget constraints with respect to innovation, simply the economics of defense procurement. And so from your perspective, Dr. Despanie, how do current budgetary constraints influence the pace and direction of innovation in U.S. defense procurement, and what steps can be taken to demonstrate capital discipline?
Budgetary constraints, especially driven by these continuing resolutions, set the tempo by steering us towards this risk-averse mindset, and that's happening at a time when we least need it. Again, we're talking here some start-stop funding cycles followed by oh, okay, now you have the money, hurry and spend it, and all of that is actually going towards really funding legacy platforms that may not even be responsive to today's geostrategic challenges. So this leaves us with a predictable net effect where fielding things too late, too expensively, and often at too small of a scale. One example of this is the $140 billion Sentinel, which is supposed to be our next generation replacement for the Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic system. Unfortunately, a recent GAO, because in Washington there's often these initialisms, but GAO stands for the Government Accountability Office, that holds government's feet to the fire. This recent GAO report raised my heart rate because it basically showed that the Air Force is now expected to keep the Minuteman III system, which first was fielded in 1970, out in service until 2050. The Sentinel, which is supposed to be the next generation replacement, won't even start fielding until 2033. The big problem is that there actually was a new annual report that went out to Congress that tracks how the People's Liberation Army in China is making military advances. And they found that the Dongfang 27 is now operational as an intercontinental ballistic missile with hypersonic glide vehicle capabilities. So this is, when you hear something like hypersonics, it sounds like a bunch of googly goop. But the reality is that this means that you could essentially hit the Pacific homeland, right? Our states, we're talking like Washington, Oregon, California. You could hit those without even being detected with current radar systems, right? That's how fast hypersonic glide vehicles move. and they represent the unfortunately like the next shift towards like missile capabilities. Yet we're still worrying about, again, the cost overruns for the Sentinel system. So the fiscal year 26 National Defense Authorization Act tries to push back on this by expanding, the eligibility for like multi-year procurement contracts so that we have a more stable demand signal for, potential contractors, especially as it pertains to the munitions procurement. Another aspect where we're also beginning to see more of a shift towards like somewhat of a VC mindset is this idea of having portfolio-based acquisition as opposed to programmatic. And when we hear programmatic, one way of thinking about that is that almost like it's like a mandate, whereas with the portfolio-based acquisition approach, that would instead be something that's more, again, like a VC, right? Where you fund, like, let's say 10 potential ideas, and maybe like 2 of them will become home runs, but that infuses more entrepreneurship into our current procurement, like vehicles and mechanisms. But with a $1 trillion fiscal year 26 budget, the way towards efficiency involves like pairing like a sense of urgency and strategic competition with the capital discipline. And that involves the fact that you have to pick fewer priorities. You have to work with allies. You have to permit a fail faster like mindset, which is entrepreneurial, right? Because the faster you fail, the quicker you'll get to successes, which is counterintuitive because most things tend to be risk averse whenever you're dealing with such large budgets. And then lastly, you have to scale the winners sustainably once you've identified them. Shipbuilding can be a poster child here. And a good example of this is the fact that South Korea's Hanwha Ocean just recently purchased Philly Shipyard. And this represents an excellent example of an allied industrial partnership that introduces innovative shipbuilding practices. It expands the US manufacturing base. And thirdly, it reduces timeline risk.
That was a really insightful answer. You mentioned a few other countries and you mentioned different stakeholders that exist that work within this particular arena. And so the next question would be, what type of effective strategies could we have for bringing together a diverse set of stakeholders, thinking of things like subcontractors, prime contractors, regulators, and think tanks in the defense sector? And how can these collaborations lead to more effective and innovative solutions?
I'll start off by saying that the real key here is incentive alignment. At the end of the day, whenever you're mentioning all these different players, they all live in different worlds with different timelines, different risk tolerances, and different definitions of success. So the strategy here, if I may offer one, involves picking one clear operational problem, right? Let's say, again, developing a next generation intercontinental ballistic missile system, or coming up with a modernized aircraft carrier that can actually meet the needs of the 21st century. And that involves bringing together all these stakeholders and then structuring a partnership around those shared deliverables. And realistically, this is different from how things are currently done, precisely because there's often this siloing, mindset, siloing, finish the piece, and then hand it off to the next, part. And that is good for like a module-based approach, but the reality is that sometimes we need to be, doing things simultaneously as opposed to in parallel. And once we do that, and you have a product, you can then run everything through critical go, no-go, demonstrations, which is, again, very, very, very familiar and common in the entrepreneurial space, right? Where, companies are supposed to live or die on proving or not proving a key capability. And to that framework that I just identified, you bring in regulators early, so you're not building something that won't even make it to the end of the finish line, while at the same time, you can actually integrate the think tankers like myself into the mix as translators and red teamers, which is something that people tend to sleep on. But the fact is that you literally have a bunch of eggheads like myself. And yeah, we're really the ones that are beta testing some of these ideas, especially as they pertain to more emerging technology areas. And when you do that, you move faster, you reduce risk, and you scale innovation in the real world instead of just keeping it trapped on some PowerPoint slide.
If we look at places like Silicon Valley, for example, where, biotech has a headquarters and we have all of our tech companies, we know that, about 70% of the people who work in Silicon Valley are foreign born, for example. We know that diversity of thought helps move us along in terms of technology, bringing stakeholders together, et cetera. How do things like cracking down on immigration, H-1B visas, how do things like, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, how do we place kind of limitations on ourselves when it comes to this? But at the same time, they're relatively reasonable limitations, because at the same time, you do want to have some kind of sovereignty in the way in which you're going about technology, specifically when it comes to defense. And we do know, a lot of technologies, for example, like in the space sector or the tech sector, they're technically civilian, but then they can be converted to have military or defense applications.
You hit on two excellent concepts that I'll break, and answer piecemeal. So the first one, I agree wholeheartedly with you. In fact, there is a saying by Walter Lippmann, who is basically comes up with most of the things that we accept as received truths today. But one thing that he's quoted as saying in one of his earlier texts is, in a place where where all think alike, not much actually gets done. And it's the same thing here, where we need to have the immigrants coming in, like high-skilled immigrants coming in, who can help, improve our technological and manufacturing base. But the thing is that this needs to be restructured in some ways, right? We're seeing that the H-1B visa pathway, that's actually being exploited by technology companies, when the operative reality is that we need to come together as a nation and realistically decide like what we want out of our immigration policy, right? We spend so much time in a reactionary posture, focusing on who to get out, which is a critical aspect of national security. But one thing that we need to do is we need to ask more fervently, what is our immigration policy doing for us? How can we preferentially attract the minds, the talent, the skills through human capital, and incentivize them to really want to come here and work hard, right? Most of that has largely been predicated upon America's soft power advantage, but it's not, none of that is actually codified like realistically in our laws, right? Because our laws are focused more on family reunification, when the operative reality, and again, I'm speaking only in my own capacity, is that we need to take an approach that is based off of a merit-based system that is also quantifiable. We really need like a points-based immigration system that literally makes it legible to anyone that can pick up a paper and see, based off of these points and whatnot, this is why this person is here.
That's exceptional insight. Definitely up the alley with respect to Homeland Security. I think there has to be a way to continuously convene people together to have these important discussions. Equally so, you need to have the innovators in the room. You need to have the prime contractors, subcontractors demonstrate a willingness to engage different policy practitioners as well as individuals within the think tank space. On that point, Dr. Despanie, I think it's important for us to even shed light on what you've discussed about streamlining these collaborations and these solutions. And it sounds like you've already gotten to some of this in your previous answers. But what is your proposed formula even if you were to bring people together yourself in Washington, D.C. or in San Diego, right, where there's a significant naval presence? Do you have any ideas?
In this regard, the thing that's literally top of mind for me right now is the fact that the PLA, the People's Liberation Army Navy, just had the maiden voyage of the Fujian. The Fujian is their third aircraft carrier after the Liaoning and the Shandong, and this is their most advanced, even though there already preparing for a fourth. But this is the operative reality that shows that we're not doing this, for some abstract reason, right? Like we are operating, with a near peer competitor. And in order to actually make all of this work, not just on paper, but in practice, we would realistically need to have, an integrated, system, right? And this integrated system means that you have like a talent pipeline, right? Where you have like, let's say these, young students that are getting their, undergraduate or master's degree, knowing full well that they already have potential internships and jobs lined up to like work doing, the project management or the technical work to actually build said ships. In addition, we need to pull that together with the congressional authorities, right? And that's, on the budgetary side, as well as the appropriation side, to say, hey, this is a carve out to, this, contract or whatnot that has been awarded specifically for let's say San Diego, or let's say for Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania or what have you, but, almost making like a little map or a node based approach where you have innovation in these nodes. And then third aspect of that would actually be, and again, this is something that I emphasized a little earlier with my answer focusing on Hanwha Ocean, is that you also get buy-in from our allies. The thing is that we're focusing on reshoring, but that doesn't mean that we have to exclude our allies who actually have the tacit knowledge to help us jumpstart, this whole new domestic manufacturing boom, right? And I really feel that even though Hanwha and South Korea are one example, you also have that same skill set with shipbuilding with Japanese companies. And realistically, we cannot do it alone. I mean, we would like to think so, but it just is so much easier if you have a coalition for achieving technological predominance, as opposed to just trying to rely only on oneself. But again, I understand that occurs in a piecemeal and sector by sector manner, right? As opposed to it just being a blanket statement for every single sector. But that is where my thinking is regarding shipbuilding.
I think it's clear that we have heard it from Dr. Despanie himself with regards to some potential ideas to act on ways to convene people to take some action steps to make sure that there's something get it done. So perhaps we can expect something from your end.
In terms of that would be very intriguing. Not in shipbuilding and whatnot, but definitely another aspect because people tend to, when they hear national security, right? We typically think of the the aircraft carriers. We think of the ships. We think of the guns, but people often discount the fact that health security is national security. And by that, I mean that a nation can't fight if it's not well, right? If it's ill. And one key aspect of that actually laid us low, just about 5 years ago, was the SARS coronavirus 2 pandemic. And one key aspect of ensuring national security also entails pandemic preparedness. And on top of pandemic preparedness, making sure that your most critical supply chains, and by this, I'm not only talking about rare earth elements or critical minerals, but also understanding where your active pharmaceutical ingredients and key starting materials actually are for your drugs. Imagine if there is to be a major war and our supplies of acetaminophen and salicylic acid are cut off. So acetaminophen is Tylenol and salicylic acid is aspirin. So if that gets cut off, right, I mean, those are just the most basic, critical, essential medicines. And if we vouchsafe our core aspects of supply chain resiliency to a potentially adversarial nation, we'll find ourselves up a creek without a paddle.
I appreciate that perspective. I think it's one that I've advocated for a lot of times. Because people have a very narrow view, like you said, about national security. And I think there's a lot of exogenous factors about populations that make you more prone to losing or having issues compared to not. I think, for example, here in the US, most people don't know how to get fresh drinking water if our water facilities or water treatment plants went down. Or a lot of people don't know how they would get food. Or if we were to lose electricity, we would be in a much more precarious position than if a country that didn't need it as much lost their electricity. And so I appreciate that point.
Dr. Despanie, to level set where we're taking the conversation next, and this is something that I think is paramount right now that some people are starting to think about, but I think a lot more people on the U.S. side of things need to think about. It's our long-term strategy. Countries such as China tend to have streamlined long-term planning processes and plans in place, whereas in the United States, things tend to go back and forth every few years. I think fundamentally there are topics that are less political, that have been phrased in ways that are quite political and that can derail progress to some extent. But this also touches upon what we're seeing right now in terms of certain international engagements in the likes of Nigeria, and the likes of Venezuela, and in the likes of Somalia, where there will be long-term implications that cannot be undone. These are areas of influence where, at least with respect to our military engagements, there seems to be a continued posture, at least for this administration, of, hey, these are some of our strategic immediate priorities, and this will lay the ground for future engagement. From your perspective, how do these military engagements that I've just outlined reflect America's immediate strategic priorities? And are these priorities sustainable in the long run? In other words, are these priorities worth being considered as part of America's long-term strategic planning process and long-term strategy that hopefully bear some fruit in the near future?
Quite a shotgun blast, of things to consider in the query. And in my, response, I'm actually going to have to lean on the national security strategy that was dropped last month. And that's instructive mainly because it acts almost like a geostrategic compass for an America that's focused on trying to do two things at once using short but sharp kinetic action. First is that we want to keep terrorism contained at our periphery while not letting it consume all of our resources. And that's how things are playing out with the counterterrorism operations in East and West Africa. And then secondly is that we're also focusing now on reasserting hemispheric authority through this new Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And that was on ready display with the Operation Absolute Resolve, which actually ended up causing the shifting of this podcast date. But here's my read. If these peripheral engagements can remain time-bound, have clear outcomes, and involve partner buy-in where appropriate, then they'll be sustainable. A good example of how you can have a successful short but sharp approach in a peripheral arena would actually be last year's Operation Midnight Hammer, which targeted Iranian nuclear facilities and finally moved the needle on a policy issue that stymied administrations for the past 2 decades. Over the long term, on the other hand, I fervently believe that our priorities as a Pacific power should be solely trained on the Indo-Pacific. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves wondering, why are we not, able to successfully match ends and means? And it would probably be because we ended up rebranding mission creep. as like a new strategic interest, when the reality is that the Indo-Pacific is where we need to be focused, like at least up until 2049.
I hear you, Dr. Despanie. Some of these problem areas have existed for a long time, and whether it be a decade, 2 decades, or even longer. I think even when we think about making sure that there's some sustainability with how the United States goes about actually creating strategic engagements that are more sustainable and less prone to these shifts that can come from one administration to the next. I mean, this plays a really critical role in aligning our current priorities, or even previously. I think regardless of the administration, there have been some positive strides taken that could be built upon to some extent in the future. And so, from your viewpoint, how can the U.S. make these engagements more sustainable, ensuring continuity and stability in long-term policy?
In order to actually render this sustainable over the long term, again, I might date myself here as an institutionalist, but the reality is that we really need to have the Senate's role needs to be the Senate's role. The House's role needs to be the House's role, and not to take the audience on this history lesson or whatnot. But the reality is that we've seen a shift over like the years towards like what's called an imperial presidency. I believe that was the term that was coined by Richard Hofstadter, in describing the fact that as the years have gone on, the executive branch has arrogated more power unto itself, which is not in keeping with how the founders actually plotted things out, right, in the Constitution, wherein the first branch of government was actually Congress, the legislative branch, and then secondly, all three branches were considered to be like rivals amongst themselves for power, and that would actually serve to check ambitions. And we're not necessarily seeing that, and because we're not seeing that, Josh, what's happening is that things are coming down to us through executive fiat, which is great as a tactic, but as strategically, it just leads to this, whiplash, we're going to fund this, we're not going to fund this. And the things that actually we need to focus on, like the Sentinel ICBM program that we discussed at the top of the call, that just kind of falls by the wayside, because, if I just duck my head down, neither the switching parties for the presidential administration will notice us. But the reality is that once you enshrine that in law, you reduce the opportunities to have this what do I even want to call it, Twizzler policy shifts. So that's the first thing that needs to realistically happen, where we need to agree on a one that each branch of government is jealous for its own power, and then secondly that we agree almost on an operating system for government that acts in many senses like a strategic bill of rights. We always agree, regardless of this administration or that administration, that we need to set as a minimum this amount of funding for our shipbuilding capacity, or for building out intercontinental ballistic missiles, or for even focusing on new initiatives like directed energy weapons. So that's the thing that needs to happen. But again, a lot of this we're talking at the institutional level. But remember, institutions, Josh, are packed with humans, right? And those humans, they need, we need pipelines and pathways for them to actually come into government and to be able to institute the change we hope to see. And a key aspect of that indeed comes through these programs that actually bring people that are, not, native to DC or these national security issues into the, into the national dialogue, because only by, expanding the conversation can we identify the thinkers who say, oh, this is a problem. Like, here's a potential solution that you may not have thought of. And that's something that I myself am a recipient of, having originally, started out as a life scientist and then found myself in the national security space. Like, one thing that we also need to realize as fellow Americans is the fact that having like these experiences across different aspects of the country, like that only strengthens your resolve and your love of country. I mean, I'll be honest, I believe this is my 5th state that I've lived in, but suffice to say that only by seeing the full expanse of like your home do you get a sense of, oh, I know what the strengths are, I know what the weaknesses are, and then deciding that here are the opportunities and here are the threats, which you, Joshua, know is like a SWOT analysis.
Yes, and that's something that I admire about you, your ability to translate technical into commercial aspects. I think it's all about how can we shape the conversation forward.
We'll move into our last question. We've learned a lot, and so we'll see how we'll get to see the culmination of everything wrap up in the final question. But if we think about minimizing political fluctuations, in what ways can the U.S. develop a more cohesive and enduring strategy that transcends political cycles or administrations, and how can stakeholders work together to minimize the impacts of these fluctuations on long-term goals?
I appreciate that question, expressly because it almost has a poetic ring to it, right? A strategy that transcends political cycles, right? It's having been in the snake's den that is Washington, D.C., I know that, that's very hard to transcend political cycles, but it also hits at the fact that this is realistically an institutional engineering problem. The U.S. gets continuity when the strategic priorities are actually encoded into laws, into budgets, multi-year contracts, and the allied architectures I've mentioned beforehand that actually create real demonstrable switching costs. And for the stakeholders, this is clear that Congress is the one that like sets the guardrails. The DoD will be the one that executes, like, with this newfound portfolio level discipline. That then draws in industry so that it can step up investments via public-private partnerships. And then we have allies like Japan and South Korea that can co-produce so that all of these programs, they just become, like a tough nut to crack, right? They're just, impossible to unwind regardless of like which administration, like from which party is in office. And that is key, right? It's exactly right. It's not even what the Zhongneng High is doing in the PRC is it just is understood, right? I mean, even in the shift from Hu Jintao to Xi Jinping, right? Like the thing is that even across those administrations, there was always like this understanding that China had to build out like these strategic emerging investments, right? And those were in things like biotech, right? Those were things in like electric vehicles. And now you're seeing the fruits of those labor, coming to roost.
Dr. Despanie, as we wrap up this episode of The Global Signal, do you have any thoughts that you would like to leave with our audience listening today?
I'm tracking 2 other things that your viewers may be interested in. One is the upcoming National Defense Strategy, which will match the ends presented in last month's National Security Strategy, which I mentioned earlier, with the means available to achieve them. And then secondly is the JP Morgan Chase Global Healthcare Conference, which opens in San Francisco this Monday. It's basically the biotech industry Super Bowl. And I need to know what are all the latest ADCs and bispecific antibodies and all the other fun things that, biotech savvy people, care about, because at the end of the day, that innovation eventually comes down to the patient.
Well, you have heard it first, ladies and gentlemen, from Dr. Jordan Despanie. Some things to monitor and watch as we carry the momentum that we've had from this discussion today, whether it be you are in the biohealth space or you are in the national security space. There are some clear implications that we hope is useful for our audience listening or even watching today. Dr. Jordan Despanie, it's been a pleasure to have you on this episode of The Global Signal. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.